Hello, welcome to the GW Book Club, where my good friend Stu and I read classic Games Workshop books from yesteryear. Now, most of the time, we read classic fiction from Warhammer and 40k, but sometimes we do these non-fiction episodes, not strictly speaking non-fiction, but more or less, because we deal with the Codex books and the Warhammer Armies books. So today, we're going to be going through Warhammer Armies Wood Elves from the fourth edition of the game. Stu, how are you doing?
Really good, really good. Enjoyed this one a lot as well. But I
Yeah, it
always
was
do.
another
These
classic.
fourth edition books are just great.
Yeah, yeah, really, really good stuff. I mean, even from starting with the Dave Gallagher cover, which is just absolute classic image of Wood Elves. I love it. I don't know that it has had the same sort of timeless impact as some of the other Warhammer Armies book covers, but I also
Agreed.
don't know if that's just because you didn't see the Wood Elves book as much, maybe. But it's still a great piece of art, isn't it?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, I think you're right. It doesn't have that same feel for me either. The some of the others feel more famous. And I
Mm,
don't know what the order was that they came out into. Maybe this was towards the end of a run or something, and we're a bit more used to them by then. But it doesn't feel quite as familiar as the High Elves one did, or the Empire one,
mm.
or even the Dwarf one for that matter. But it's still very cool, and they're so vibrant, they're so colourful. It really says everything you need to know about the era.
Yes, it does. Yeah, yeah, and the writing of this book is by Nigel Stillman. There are stories by Jonathan Green, but I mean, I think Stillman obviously a great writer for a lot of different Warhammer projects. Some really really cool stuff. Obviously, he was a major fan of the Bretonians. I'm not too surprised that that maybe was part of the reason he was behind the Wood Elves because there's obviously a lot of overlap and a lot of shared history there. But the sort of storytelling across the book is really effective. I mean, like all of the fourth edition armies books, it does, I think, a really good job of just establishing, okay, here is what this faction looks like and acts like in this version of the Warhammer world. Here's their history, here's their armies, here's some cool characters. It is a really comprehensive package for getting started with a brand new army, I think.
Yeah, 100%. And I don't know whether it's a mixture of this being the first time that the true full story is laid out,
Hmm.
because this is definitely the development of the game. Fourth edition is the birth of the game we know now through the old world. I think it's the start of that. It's definitely a different thing. And it feels like, well, this is our moment to set each of these factions up in great detail, really fill in that lore and background. Um, and and I also find, and this is a different author than the previous ones we've talked about, they've got a similar style and they're very easy to read. And I find these so much easier to absorb than I do reading an eighth edition army book. Sometimes they try to be a little bit more flowery with the writing style and the more epic in their prose, and I find it a little bit harder to stay in that lore. Even though I love the lore, I find it a little bit harder to. But these, they just resonate with me. Maybe it's my age, but they just resonate with me that there's narrative and there's stories in there, but the background reads a bit like a history, an easy history to read, and you find it really, really absorbing and very easy to kind of read, and it stick in my head because that's not always the case.
Sure, yeah, and I agree, and I think maybe some of that is because you're right. It does read kind of like, in a good way, like a
Mm,
history textbook. It kind of
yeah,
is like, well, here are the facts and here's what happened. And obviously, you're getting it from a perspective, but there's also a degree of just like, this is the history. And you get this, like, the mythology and the kind of epic nature of it is just, it's all there. These are amazing, magical, epic stories. But because they're talked about as like, here's what happened when this guy turned up, and here's what happened when these people arrived, it doesn't need to be as flowery and as sort of epic in the way it's written because the
yeah,
epicness is kind of just baked in. Whereas maybe because those stories had become more familiar, they'd been told 4 or 5 times by the time you get into the eighth edition Armies books, there was maybe a need or a feeling of a need to kind of bring the epicness into the actual writing itself. So it kind of got
yes.
more and more, I don't want to say over the top, but more flowery, I guess.
Yeah, yeah, and maybe it's just the way I'm interpreting it now, and I might go back and reread one of those eighth edition books and think, actually, it's not quite the way I've perceived it. But going back to these and revisiting these, they've definitely felt just really accessible and really nice. And now, if someone came to me new to Warhammer, and I think we've got that a little bit with people with Warhammer the Old World, because they don't have these. They have these arcane journals, which are can only got a few hundred words to squeeze whole histories that were in these books. And if you haven't played Warhammer before, you haven't got the full story. So if someone said to me, like, I really actually want to know more about a faction, I would probably just say, it seems a bit weird, but go and try and get a fourth edition army book, because those are just a really great way of getting into and understanding the world of Warhammer and those factions. And yet maybe some bits will have changed, so there might be some things that have changed over the years, retconned, as people would like to say. But I would definitely think these are the best starting point from my personal point of view.
I think it's a good shout. Yeah, I think it's a really good shout. And again, because you're getting this nice, clean, accessible history of this faction, how they came to be, what we understand as the sort of baseline of that faction. And you're right, there are certain retcons. I think the Wood Elves, I wouldn't say there's major retcons, but there are changes that happen as they evolve from this point on. And I think some of them are really good. You know, there's ideas that they introduce. I think, like, is it the world route that you can travel between forests, and there's lots of different wood elf colonies scattered around. In this book, it's way more focused on Athol Loren. So it is so zoomed in on just this one forest, and that does make sense, and we can explore some of that in a sec. But there's maybe one reference, I think, to the lost. The lost kinband, maybe, that, like, a group that went off to some other forest somewhere. It doesn't even say which one. So there is, there's a little nugget of, there's probably other wood elves in case you want to fight a battle in some other part of the game world. But all of the lore here, or 99% of the lore here, is focused on Athol Loren, how the wood elves of Athol Loren came to be. Which is an interesting choice, I think. And I can sort of see why they made it at this time. But it does kind of, it literally geographically closes you in, but it also closes you in when it comes to more storytelling ideas for later.
Yeah, maybe, or it leaves it up to you. It's a bit like the Space Marine chapters thing, isn't it? Whereas, like, we were going to tell you how the society works, but also, hey, in the trees, it could be some wood elves. You can go and make up your own stories now, paint them your way for your own armies if you want to. And you can say that they live in this forest here or this woodland here in this part of
you absolutely
the wider
could.
world.
You absolutely could. But I do find it interesting that especially during this period where, like, and even in this Armies book, there is a real effort, I think, across Games Workshop stuff to sort of say, okay, we need to explain in each of these books how two different players with the same army could end up fighting. So, like, that is in all of the books. There is, like, okay, well, the Empire cities, they're on the same side, but also they sometimes fight, and they have different uniforms, so you can paint your guys however you want. Same for the High Elves. They're all different kingdoms, so they might be fighting against each other. So you kind of bake in, there is always a legitimate reason for two of the same faction to be at loggerheads. You do sort of have that here, but because you do have the different kindreds of the Wood Elves and the different peoples, but it's much more. It's written far more as if the Wood Elves of the Warhammer world are one group of people who all live in Athol Loren. So not literally, but the way this book is written it gives a big sense of that, I think.
Yeah, I think so. I think that kind of remains for the later editions, and by the 8th edition book, and I've been looking at that myself recently because it just happens that they happen to own digitally. I bought it back when they went for that weird period, and they have these weird digital editions you bought through, and that it has a map there that is just Athol Loren, but it focuses on the different areas and the different sort of their own version of cities, I suppose, their own regions, same way as you've got Empire regions, and the different paint schemes that you would get depending on what area you're looking. So Halson's the sort of the largest area. That's your Reichland of the Elven world. So maybe at this stage that wasn't developed in the same way. So you've created those different regions within Athol Loren, within later books, it still doesn't feel like they've expanded that far beyond the borders of that forest. So
Sure.
I don't know. I don't. Maybe that just hasn't. They haven't developed that far at the moment. This has only been
Yeah.
born now, isn't it?
Yeah. True.
And again, they are a sub story of the Elven story, and they can't tell this story without starting with the story we already know of the elves expanding onto the into the old world and then leaving again. So you've got all the story about the War of the Beard and all of that stuff that kind of goes into this, and you can't tell this story until all of that's already been covered.
Yeah.
And you see that every edition they go, "Oh, we've kind of got to tell the story of the High Elves
Yeah, we're gonna have the
in
dwarves in
brief,
there. Yeah. Yeah.
and the War of the Beard." Before we can start talking about why these wood elves are still here and what makes them different about their kin from over the sea now.
I do quite like that though, in one sense, because there's kind of that meta element of the fact that the high elves and the wood elves, they literally came from the same range of miniatures. And they were just elves at one point, essentially, for Warhammer and D&D and other games beforehand. So that they're actually sort of baking in that kind of meta narrative of, well, like, these guys started off as one range of
Yeah,
miniatures, and then they broke off into two separate ranges. That's quite interesting to have made to folded that into the story and the fluff. What's, I guess, even more interesting than that sort of aspect is that it flipped it from the real world version, where it has become that the wood elves are a subsection of the high elves, right? Like you
yes,
say, they are, whenever all of the elves return to Ulthuan, some are left, and those ones that are left in the old world, rather than stay in their cities that will be mostly empty, they gravitate towards the forest, and then
right.
their culture evolves and changes. In the actual sort of development of the Citadel range, most elves were really wood elves, and then the high elves kind of eventually became more and more sort of, prominent and ordered, and the sort of warlike faction that they are. So that then became the dominant faction, even though wood elves were more present earlier on, I think. So I find that inversion quite interesting. I mean, when you look at whenever you look at any of the sort of early fantasy games, so Hero Quest and Advanced Hero Quest and stuff like that, there it's a wood elf talisman. It's
Yes,
normally a wood elf rather than a high elf, because wood elves are the sort of, they were the original elves of the Citadel range and the sort of the real world. And then in the Warhammer world, they get turned to not be the originals. Actually, they're the sort of the
yeah,
descendants, which I think is
yeah.
an interesting thing.
It's absolutely right. I think when I think back to my first elves that I owned, and many of them are pictures of in this book, because a lot of these are, that predate the fourth edition miniatures that were released around the time. It was just elves, and then yeah, wood elves. The first elf miniatures I ever owned were from the regiment's box set
Of course.
with the 10, 10 of those, 10 dwarves, 10 skaven, 10 orcs, 10 dwarves as well. So those were the first wood elves I ever owned, and expanding upon them were other elves, and I think most of them on their tabs would say Sylvan, a Sylvan at that stage as well. And
Right.
you see the Tolkien connection there, which is first and foremost was disparate groups of essentially different types of wood elves,
Hmm.
and these quite clearly develop into what would be the Mirkwood elves. If you've read The Hobbit, and if you've seen the Hobbit film, the way the early just sort of discoveries into the forest, you describing that dream state and being lost. If
Hmm.
you've watched the Hobbit movies where the dwarves are there and they're getting lost and they're walking around in circles and they're confused, the dangerous forest that has its own life, that's exactly the way it's described in the Hobbit, the book as well, obviously, and how it's described here as well. So it's quite clearly heavily, I wouldn't say lifted, but heavily, yeah, I'll call it lifted. It's clearly
Well,
Mirkwood.
it
Athel
wasn't.
Loren is Mirkwood,
Sure, yeah. I mean,
which is fine. It's cool. I love it, but it's
yeah,
clearly
yeah.
what
There's
it is.
very much, very clear influence being drawn. Although you could also say, maybe there's drawing on similar source material of the sort of fairy and the fairy folk that live
Oh,
in
oh,
the
of
forest,
course,
and
of
and
course.
I think actually by introducing the Bretonians as a sort of, as a closely linked faction in
Mm.
the lore to the Wood Elves, obviously Stillman. he loves that he takes the Bretonnians into this sort of Arthurian place when he works on those in the fifth edition, but he kind of creates this opportunity here of well, those kind of mythological knights, those kind of like mythological medieval knights, they are the perspective of the sort of classic version of the elves. They give you the sort of folkloric perspective on the Wood Elves as
Yes.
being these weird, they're cantankerous. They can't you can sort of trust them to be good guys, but they might like you might wake up and all your armor's been stolen if you sleep in the forest, sort of thing. Because they're a bit,
Yes.
they will mess with people because they are always going to put defending the forest first, and they will use all kinds of weird and wonderful magical tricks and traps to do that.
Yes, and I suppose another element, another influence will be Dark Ages Old English or Welsh. Even if you look at a lot of
Mm.
the names, they feel very Welsh. You look at war dances and the paint and things; it feels very, very much like Druidic kind of early cultures. So you've got that element layered in with the Tolkien Mirkwood, and then all the,
Yeah.
like you said, the fairy kind of stuff. All those three elements going to give you Warhammer Wood Elves, and it's a really nice mix, to be honest with you. It's surprising how well it overlays and blends together,
Mm.
and it means you can get quite a lot of different imagery from the same kind of miniatures ranges, and you still see that today when you've got your Eternal Guard there with their spears, who just look like slightly more wood elfish high elves. They're still quite militaristic and organised, but they're quite neatly presented. But then you've got your war dancers, especially this era, where they're almost there's a Harlequin-esque almost, isn't there?
Oh
There's that
yeah.
real kind of
Yeah.
overlay there. So you've got part Harlequin, part early Britain. Maybe they'd be fighting off in an Asterix novel as well. They feel like they fit into all of those kind of different genres. So yeah,
Yeah.
lots of influences.
That's all really good points. And it almost feels like maybe the reason they didn't do anything with Albion for so long is because they used up so much of what could have been a sort of Albion material in the Wood Elves.
Mm.
So yeah, I think that's definitely fair. And I completely agree. I think it's almost certainly the case that Harlequins were just let's do 40k war dances. And
Yeah,
how can we sci-fi it up a bit?
yeah.
And don't get me wrong, it's amazing. I think the Harlequin lore and stories are fantastic. So it's great that they exist, but they're just war dancers in space.
They are, and they're but more popular and better known now by
Of course,
far.
as often is
As
the
there's many
case for
things. Yeah,
40k stuff, yeah.
give it a
But
go.
yeah, I mean, what were your thoughts overall on the sort of wood elf, like the story of the wood elves here?
I quite like it. I like the way it's presented. It's very. I like the sort of the respect and the meld of the forest, and then the elven culture a little bit more laid back than the high elves. But it was a kind of, well, we'll live on the outskirts for a while and we'll see how things go, and eventually those cultures accept each other and realize they're probably good for each other,
Hmm.
and can help each other protect. And it's and you see the it's either dwarves finding their way in if they want to have an enemy, or orcs or something. Sometimes Skaven as well, always with quite derogatory names given to this. They're quite funny, or bumbling Bretonians most of the time
Yeah.
as well. Yeah, there was some of the stories are quite funny. There's even swearing in French in one of the stories. I don't know if you noticed that nerd was used. I was like, okay, that's interesting.
It was
So
fun,
there's
yeah.
actually swearing in a army book. But it's in French as well, right? Because obviously no one French ever reads it. Um, it's, it's probably was translated into French,
I
apart
wonder
from
what
that.
they translated it to, yeah.
I wonder if they changed it to English, just the word or swapped it around.
Yeah,
But
I mean, I like the story that we get here, and I really like the idea that, as you say, it's set up with the leaving of the High Elves, the War of the Beard, and all that sort of stuff, and then you do get 2,000 plus years of cultural shift and development,
mm,
so that is why the Wood Elves are so different to the High Elves.
yeah,
I really like this conception of the Wood Elves. I think for later versions, they maybe get a bit more they become even more alien, I think,
yeah,
and and they're sort of less. Their actions become impossible to understand, and they become not necessarily aloof. I'm not sure what the right word would be, but because they've
Recluse.
yeah, they've definitely become more reclusive, even more reclusive than they are here.
Mm.
But I think you get to a place where they're just not as nice, I guess. Yeah, and I
Yeah,
suppose that's the grimdark nature of where Warhammer ultimately goes. Here, although they are reclusive and they are, the forest has to be protected and they will mess up anybody who tries to damage it. They're also quite happy to sort of let Bretonians hang out, and they only, even when they come to actually wreak a terrible vengeance on the Bretonian baron who sort of takes a fortress and tries to build a fortress in the forest, that is, they do it in a kind of like this kind of magical mythical curse kind of way that's quite creative and kind of creates the superstition that then aids them. Whereas I think we get to a place where they'd just be like they'd just be killing everyone. There's kind of like a merciless nature that maybe comes
yeah,
later on.
yeah. I think you're right. This definitely. Well, there's more of that Tolkien-esque
Yeah,
Mirkwood
yeah,
elf in this, and I think that maybe for those reasons, maybe that's why we need to make them more Warhammer IP-ish, and they
sure.
seem to have developed a little bit more. And let's make them different to high elves as well.
Mm.
That's these are more dangerous, aren't they? And
They do
less
feel
lively.
different to high elves here,
Mm.
though, and I do like the idea that because although they are, they do exist within their forests and they love their forests, there's still enough space here, I think, for those heroes and adventurers who go out into Advanced Hero Quest or into Warhammer Quest or wherever.
Yeah,
Like it feels like that would make sense in a way that maybe when they get a bit more angry later
yeah.
on, it doesn't quite make as much sense to me, at least.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. I'm trying to think back my perception of them, and some of that is coloured by what they were when I first started playing the game, which was a little bit more akin to this.
Mm,
So that always remains, even though if you were to read the eighth edition book on its own, you might well think that it's a bit more focused on the tree spirit side, and
yeah,
that feels less about nurturing protection of nature, and we will only attack you if you put us in danger, to even the design of the miniatures. If you look at them, and we'll talk about this I'm sure in a bit, the dryads here, and what the way they look, it's all fun Treeman-esque stuff, a bit like the Blood Bowl Treeman at the time. And you look at dryads now and the whole tree spirit stuff you got going on with Sylvaneth, which is almost horror like
yeah,
now. And there's a real shift to that sort of dangerous horror light. They don't look like they're there to just protect the forest. They look like they're there to murder you.
yeah.
Whereas, and they will come out of their forest to murder you. They seem dangerous. Whereas here they're a little bit more kind of, yeah, again, a bit more like Tolkien-esque style of it. And I
Yeah.
think some of it's going to be visuals as well, and how that interacts with the way we read things
Mm.
and interpret it. So some of it will be visuals as much as what's written and in the story.
Yeah, because I think you're totally right on the sort of the almost the body horror element of
Mm,
later versions, especially Age of Sigmar's version of what would be Wood Elves. But you kind of feel like in this era, if you got lost in the forest, you've got just as much chance of being invited to some kind of feast,
yeah,
and like a celebration, and then not
yeah,
remembering anything about it after the fact, as you would have just being torn apart. Whereas,
yes,
in later versions of these guys, you're only getting torn apart no matter what you did. And so I kind of like these slightly softer versions of the
mm,
Wood Elves. They are still dangerous. They're still super effective hunters, and they will defend the forest, to the death. But they're also, you know, they're kind of like more friendly, I suppose, ultimately,
yeah,
which I guess is, that's purely personal preference. But I like that, and I like how the culture here is talked about. Maybe I would have liked a little bit more about the spirits of the forest, because you don't really
hmm,
get much about the dryads and the tree men here. They're in it, but they're not. There's not a lot about them. It's all the
no,
elves of the forest. But yeah, there's some really fun stuff in here. There's some cool stories, and I think they make for an exciting army.
mm,
I think probably one of the only drawbacks really from a lore perspective is kind of what I was alluding to before, which is it's so focused on Athel Loren and this sort of area of the world. The way the stories are told, the number of conflicts they have, we don't yet have the sort of the great enemy of the Beastmen. That's kind of not really touched on here at all.
Yeah,
And I think that really helps. I think that's a great thing to add in later. So here you kind of get, well, they're in this tiny little corner of the old world. One side is all mountains that surrounds them. So yeah, I guess orcs and goblins can come in, but not a lot of stuff is going to attack them. The other side is Bretonians, with whom they are, lifelong allies now. So there's not as much natural like conflict built in
yeah,
the same way there is for other. You look at the Empire, and then not only are they fighting each other, they're fighting everyone all the time.
yes, yeah,
Whereas here, you kind of do get the sense that the Wood Elves they're reclusive. They only march to war in exceptional circumstances, and even then, it's only against certain armies because they're the only ones who could possibly reach them.
yeah, yeah. I suppose the whole story of the deal with the Bretonians is resolves a lot of that, doesn't it? Rather than setting up jeopardy, it actually resolves
Yeah,
some of it.
it ensures the safety and then
And
lack
then they join NATO. It's kind of,
of. Yeah,
it's kind of like it definitely kind of it does take away a little bit of it, and maybe that's why over later editions you've seen that kind of change between
probably.
they are recluse and they are dangerous and they will only come out when their lands are in danger, and
Mm,
you see that with the ramping of the world and the end times.
yeah,
Suddenly the world was in danger, and that's why that you can coax them out, or they need coaxing out. And for a number of editions, they're probably a little bit sort of lost in the background, and
yeah,
they have been in
yeah,
terms of
exactly.
that
Yeah,
they're not the first book to get a new edition each time. They've not
yeah,
always they've been very competitive or not at all. They've never, in terms of the gameplay on the table, they've not been a sort of a steady force all the way through like some factions have. Like
yeah,
Chaos have been pretty steady all the way through as a big faction. Lots of people play them, and they're pretty consistent throughout all the editions in terms of the amount of support and miniatures and things. Wood
mm,
Elves have very much been feast or famine in terms of
sure.
releases and what you get with them, and I think that some of that will be just they've got a difficult story to tell compared to or to
Yeah,
expand upon compared to some of the others.
I mean, I love that story for the Wood Elves of Athel Loren. I think all of that setup is great. I think them being reclusive, them aiding the Bretonians,
Mm,
that as mercenaries, essentially a mercenary or an allied faction in Bretonian armies is really cool. All of that's great. I think the only thing you needed was there were pockets of Wood Elves everywhere else in any big
yeah,
forest who maybe are not quite the same as the ones in Athenlora. But yeah, ultimately you kind of get that, and you're right. You can say that anyway, and there's enough wiggle room within the book to allow you to do it if you want to. So it's
maybe in the
interesting.
context of the whole lore of Warhammer, you need these factions. You need these
Yeah,
smaller, more nichey ones that attract a different kind of player, maybe, so that the bigger ones can be the big ones. They can't all have the same
yeah.
balance.
Everyone
And
can't be chaos, right?
yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, and it might well just be that these work for their fans because they do what they do.
yeah.
And they're never going to be as big as everything else.
I'd
They're
be
always going to
really
be.
interested to know what the sales figures were like for
Mm,
these kinds of factions compared to, or because obviously it's almost similar in some ways to the Lizard Men, who
mm,
also had a lot of trouble, like within the way they were constructed and written. Like,
yeah,
why are they here? Why are they fighting for the Nemesis crown in the Great Forest? Like, what's happened there? So you kind of end up with those sort
yeah.
of more difficult situations. And it personally, I really like these factions existing. I love the Wood Elves because I love the Warhammer world as especially as a role playing world. And really, you can justify any battle anytime, anywhere. Like having these smaller factions that are very niche and have very isolated or local stories is really fun and cool. When you then try and do global events and stuff like that and shoehorn them in, kind of feels a little bit less
Yeah,
organic, maybe.
I think I would have liked to have seen. their presence, even if it's just as envoys, so they're
Sure.
representatives turning up in capitals for
Yeah.
meetings and things, that they are very much. I don't think you can have them not being reclusive, because I think that's part of their
Yeah.
core story. But doesn't mean that you can't be a bit more visible, at least in a political sense.
Yeah.
And the politics, because for so many years the story was stagnant, set at a certain point. It's very hard to build politics and intrigue into it outside of role play, I suppose.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a fair shout, and it would be interesting to sort of explore that. Speaking of visibility,
Mm.
there is some very there's a terrible segue, but there's some very visible art in the book, which
I,
like
I tend to find visible art
yeah, I
is the
find
best kind of art. Well, that's arts can
which
be
of
audio as well, I suppose.
which pieces of art from the book did you like resonates the most and that you like the most?
Bizarrely, it's quite a small piece. We're quite often picking these big double page spreads
Hmm.
or this epic battle or something. And I really liked a small picture on page 15. It just we talked a little bit about this before we started recording, but for me, it just reminds me of reading White Dwarf in that era. It's got a nice sort of nostalgic feel to it. It feels like the miniatures of that era, and right going back to that pre-high elf era in some ways. They were just elves. They've all got the same haircut and their ear poking between the hair and through the hair and things. Always got the massive waistband which you'd see on high elves, probably still existing to this day, whereas Wood Elves you don't as much anymore, with the big gemstones in it. I mean, look at the size of those gemstones. That's there's a lot of money. There's a lot of gemstone going on there. Um, but I just really like it. I don't know why. It's just a really cool piece of black and white art that I quite like.
It's great. It's very evocative, and it's kind of it shows the wood elves as quite threatening and quite they look cool, they look dangerous, and it's yeah, I like it. It's a good piece. I think for me, there's loads of great art in here. I think there's an amazing John Blanche piece as usual. That's really cool and sells the army really well. I think the Forest Dragon stuff is great as well. But the piece that I like the most is probably the Dave Gallagher War Dancer. So it's
Mhm.
originally from the well, I don't know if it was in this before it was in the Warhammer Quest box for the War Dancer character, or what the
It could have been.
timeline of releases was. I know that he was commissioned to do a whole range of these portraits for Warhammer Quest, so I would assume it was for that, and they
Yeah.
just reproduced it here. But just really cool. I just really like the dynamism. I love because the war dancers, such a fun creation, and they have this long history. They date back to being one of the earlier regiments of renown. There's some really fun stuff there. This absolutely is how I picture the elven war dancers. Like
Yes.
whenever I think about them, just great.
Yeah. Amazing hair going on there. Really,
Absolutely
really nice hair.
fantastic. Yeah, yeah,
And I had quite a few of the miniatures, and the miniatures were very much just like that artwork.
yeah.
There were some other miniatures, other manufactured Grenadier miniatures had some Wood Elves at the time, which had exactly the same hair. The sculpts fitted in
Right.
perfectly. I remember having a few of those. I was trying to remember to send you the pictures of those, but this was very much feels like the third ed visuals for me. So when I first
Mm.
started playing, that artwork matches, and probably the artwork I chose as well, just falls in with that, and that's got similar resonance, I think.
Yeah, yeah, fantastic stuff. Is there a favorite miniature that you have from this era, from this range?
I don't know actually. My first miniatures from this era was the plastic Wood Elves, but in
Mm.
the Regiment's box set. But um, I'm looking at a lot that I wish I had. I really like the old metal archers.
Yeah,
I'd love looking at those now, thinking, oh, I bet you they're crazy expensive. They've got so much character going on those
they're
faces.
fantastic, and
They are
they
brilliant.
really feel, and the plastic ones from this era as well. They do feel like they're harking back to the Warhammer Regiments box that you mentioned,
Mm,
and you see the individual characters in Warhammer Quest. You see them elsewhere. It feels like the archers from previous generations have been
yes.
updated in a really nice sort of sympathetic way. So yeah, they're great.
Yeah, I'm a big fan. The battle standard of the Ren, that the pose for that archer as well, looks very much like a Middle Earth miniature that came many years after Halbarad, I think. But I probably misremembered it. But the pose looks almost identical, which would be quite interesting. But I do love those War Dozens as well. I really wish I still had them. And that old Marauder Treeman as well, but he's so tiny now. I
Yeah,
nearly
he's dry.
bought him on eBay today, actually. I nearly bought him on eBay today. Not that expensive, about £25, which is unpainted, which isn't too
Right.
bad. But he's just too small, you know. You couldn't really use him as a tree man. He maybe get away with using him as a tree kin these days.
Mm.
And the old Durthu with his arm off, look back
Yeah,
like
he's
that. I
got
don't know what's
very,
going on
very
there.
long arms, that guy. Yeah, he's got tombs from X-Men, from
Yeah.
X-Files, sorry. Just, yeah, very, very long-armed guy.
And the Dryads look like they should be on a Blood Bowl pitch because most of them look like they're ready to receive a catch or have just thrown the ball. In fact, they look like a Blood Bowl team if you look at the whole page dedicated to Dryads. But
The
um,
that battle standard miniature actually is the Warhammer Quest one. They say like the little
is it?
conversion notes. Yeah, they've taken
Oh,
the Warhammer
right. There
Quest
we are
one and
then.
they've replaced the sword with the standard. It's really fun.
Amazing. So
Yeah.
by doing that, it looks like the pose of this Middle Earth miniature. I'll try
Mm.
and find again. I'll try and find a picture of that one and send it to you. But
I
yeah,
think for
lots of
me,
love for these miniatures.
yeah, lots of really nice miniatures, really, really characterful stuff. I am quite taken with the Forest Dragon. I think it's just it was always such an impressive dragon miniature.
It's
Just
very
looks great.
cool, isn't it? It is.
Yeah.
I think the paint scheme is it's just so vibrant, isn't it? I'm pretty sure from the preview, pretty sure that they showed this off, or it's in one of the pictures somewhere in the new stuff. So
I hope
I'm
so. I
sure
would
this is
love to
coming
see that.
back. It might be a made to order or something, but
I could totally imagine that. But yeah, just a really cool example of the dragon. The art matches it and is really, really nice as well.
mm,
Yeah, just fantastic stuff. Loads of great miniatures across this range. I like the eagles and the tree men. I think are really good fun. Yeah, I mean the there's obviously in this era there were loads of special characters introduced with most of the books as well. Are there any
yeah.
special characters that leap out to you and you're fond of?
I'm not super fond of the special characters now, and
Right.
it's because I didn't play with special characters as a kid. I always like to make up my own characters.
Hmm.
I never wanted to be, uh, aside from dwarves for some reason. I used to like, you like Bugman or something like that. So it doesn't mean I dislike them, but I don't have any really a strong affinity to them at all. To be honest with you, I mean, the story of Orion's always cool, isn't it?
Hmm.
And it exists to this day. So I think that's a really interesting idea. But no, and that sounds like a bit of a cop out, but I'll be making it up if I said, oh, yeah, this is my favorite one. I just genuinely don't have anything that really kind of leaps out to me that says, yeah, this is my favorite character. So that's a terrible answer
I
and
think
shuts
that's
down the
fair enough.
conversation really quickly. But
That's all right. I mean,
um,
I think with Orion, so Orion and Ariel, I think their story is really fun. You know, that they got
mm,
lost and they go into the sort of world tree or the age tree. I can't remember what it's called, but like, and then they become almost aspects of the gods, Kronos and
mm,
Aisha, and then they every year in the winter they die and then they're resurrected with spring. I think is really really fun.
I
Really cool
I think
way.
it's brilliant. Yeah,
Yeah,
I
it's
think
great,
that's good.
great. And I also I love that he is the king in the wood, and she's the queen in the wood. I think it's just like from a phrasing, it's that has this certain archaic kind of magic to it that's really nice.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, I'm quite taken. I like Scarlock. I'm glad that Scarlock is still here because obviously from the Regiment of Renown, just fantastic. I
Yes.
love that kind of heritage when they find a way to keep a character. I mean, Bugman that you mentioned is another good example, right?
Yeah.
They are from the earlier versions of the game, and they are retained throughout. Their story is expanded and explored in new ways. It's just great to see. I love it.
I mean, because they all go, don't they? They all disappear. I don't
Yeah, well,
know.
I mean, certain editions really cut back on a lot of the special characters.
Orion and Ariel remain,
Mm,
even in eighth edition. We get to see what's going to come whenever the Wood Elves are announced for the
sure.
old world. But they all disappear. I think by eighth edition we had Ariloth, maybe.
Right. Yep.
the Talsin guy, and then Dirthu. So they kind of stuck with the we need a special character treatment thing, but the rest are just all gone really, and I think they've been gone for a while. I'm pretty sure the sixth edition book didn't have much. I can't remember that right now.
Yeah, I
It's not
think
my.
a lot of the sixth edition books, like with two special characters, and
Yeah.
oftentimes they were newly created special
Mm,
characters as well, which I think is great. And you need to be able to bring in, you
agree.
need
Yeah.
new stories, and I think that's fun. I don't think not all of those characters stuck around when they got to seventh and eighth as well. Yeah, there's another feature of this book that not every book from this era had, but I really like, and that is the sample army. So at the
Hmm.
back, you get Moor's Wild Hunt, which is a 2,000 point Wood Elf army list. And
Yeah.
then there's also like a little collector's guide for, okay, so here's how we did our archers. Here's how we did our war dancers. You need two ballista packs, and that'll give you eight war dancers. Don't worry about a champion just yet because you're just getting started.
Yeah.
That's really nice. I like that. Now it's an artifact of history because you can kind of look at how releases existed and how you would put together an army at a certain time. But even at the time, I think it's really nice to see, like, because it's such an abstract element of the hobby, like
Yeah.
collecting an army, writing an army list, assembling it. Seeing that sort of stepped through is really nice.
Yeah. I think we did see it in a slightly done slightly differently, but we definitely saw the kind of what is essentially a bit of marketing at the back, isn't it? Because
Yeah,
it's pictures of the boxes that you need. And then when
sure.
we went through the Beastman book, which is obviously a lot later,
Yeah,
and that also, rather than the sample list, but it definitely had start by collecting small. This is how you paint them. So there were elements of it in there, but this has definitely another option. And I think the bigger army list is very much, it's probably a Stillman army, isn't it? Talking about how he would go about
yeah,
creating his 2,000 point army. And it is nice to have an example there for sure. Because if you are new, it helps. You just don't know what the army should look like sometimes, do you? And what's the first thing people do these days? They go on the internet to find other examples of what are you seeing on Facebook groups. Should I do I take hand weapons and shields, or do I take spears? What's the best? Because I don't want to build my models wrong, and then everyone go, "Oh, you stupid! Why did you build them like that?" Everyone knows you take them with spears or two-handed weapons. So people want that kind of information, and this was the pre-internet version of it, probably,
yeah.
which is helpful.
Yeah, and there's a roster sheet there for a 994 point army that's like
Yes.
40 models for
Yeah.
Warhammer Fantasy. It's like really nice and manageable. That's great.
Yeah. Yeah. It's a good point size. You probably get about the same amount of models now for that points, actually.
Well, for certain armies, not for all of them.
No, for Wood Elves,
Oh, sure, fair enough.
similar kind of numbers.
Yeah. But yeah, I mean, overall, I think another great example of an armies book, I think really good faction lore that adds a lot to the world. Those sort of misgivings about how localized it is aside, they add a lot to the Bretonians, they add a lot to the old world. They're a great faction in and of themselves. I think they're fun to have wood elves and their army with their dryads and spirits and great eagles and their war dancers and archers. All of that stuff is great to see. And it's brought to life in a really nice way with this book, I think.
Mhm. Absolutely. It definitely expanded on what was a little bit, I suppose, a bit of a, you've already mentioned it, you got that change away from Wood Elf miniatures to a bigger High Elf, some High Elf. Was it Sea Elves? We talked about that a little bit when we talked about the
Sure,
Hive
yeah.
book. They've gone, and now it's about redefining what elves are. And apparently they are High Elves, or they're Wood Elves,
Sure.
or they're Dark Elves.
Yeah, the Dark Elves, that's right.
And what you ended up with was something that made a lot more sense and a lot more defined and marketable and all of those things. But it's nice to see most of the elements that were in those original first, second, and third edition worlds are still available to you.
Hmm.
Sea elves via your Sea Guard, or high elves are very much expanded, and dark elves again expanded. But this is very much like the early days of it a bit.
Yeah.
Your old Sylvan Wood Elves with some weird tree people chucked in.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. It's a great. I mean, reading most of these books, it does inspire. You do. Well, I'll just speak for myself, but I find I'm flicking through, I'm reading these different bits of lore and history and the cool stories, and I do just go, oh, maybe I
Yeah.
should have a little Wood Elf army. Well, like, don't worry, I'm not going to. I'm not going to start another project, but they do get you quite excited for that army. They make you think
I
this would
think you
work.
should start. I think if you should start a tree spirit only wood elf army because you could probably paint it quick enough that you wouldn't lose the will to live in the day.
Sure,
Bit of
yeah.
brown spray and a bit of a dry brush, and you'd be like, oh, I'm done. Um, but you'll
That's
probably find
very
that's the
true,
bits you
actually.
dislike the most out of the army book, and you want all of the intricate stuff. But they would be an easier one for
That's
sure.
true. Or Beastmen, I suppose, would be a reason
Mm.
out as well.
Speed
Yeah,
painting beastmen is a thing.
sure. Well, until we return for a future GW book club, I suspect we'll have
Mm.
more of these armies books to look at over the next few months. Maybe we will even tackle an eighth edition book and sort of compare how it has changed. But
Yeah, that'd be fun.
until that time, Stu, where can people find you online?
Miniature Realms. You can see me painting the miniature I just waved around at some point in the future when I finish the video. But yeah, Miniature Realms, and all of the social media platforms as well, but they all point to Miniature Realms YouTube channel.
Fantastic. And I will put a link in the description below for all of your socials. So if anybody wants to check out Miniature Realms, they can do so via those. I've also got all of the social media platforms. It's all Jordan Sorcery. So pretty much wherever you like to do your socializing, you can find me. And I'm normally talking nonsense about Warhammer or movies or Games Workshop. So until next time, thank you all very much for joining us. I'm Jordan, and this is Jordan Sorcery.